It is 3 minutes after 10, and it's a morning, isn't it? It really is. Hard to know where to start. I think we should probably begin with a brief roundup of the cabinet of all the talents. It's a very sad state of affairs in Brexit Britain, where not having done very well in your last job is no obstacle to getting promoted to a bigger job. You could call it the Gavin Williamson effect, and it comes into effect when you have governments built on nonsense. This government, like the one before it, and to a lesser extent the one before that, is built on the nonsense of Brexit being a good idea. And anyone who dares to demur from that particular hymn sheet is absolutely confined to the outer rings of Antarctica for the rest of their foreseeable political career. So even people like Tom Tugendhat now entering cabinet with a sort of code of omerta, a code of silence. You cannot. It's like the war in Fawlty Towers, isn't it? Which reminds me, if you haven't listened to my full disclosure interview with John Cleese yet, then you are denying yourself an unparalleled pleasure, an unparalleled audio pleasure. But you just can't mention the war. I didn't mention. I mentioned it once, but I think I got away with it. That's what Brexit's like now for the cabinet. Except, of course, to pretend that Boris Johnson A, got it done, and B, that if he had got it done, that would have been a good thing. But you're seeing people now being promoted into positions despite having been awful in their last jobs. Do you remember what James Cleverly was doing yesterday? Do you remember what he was doing last week? Secretary of State for Education. Yeah, I know. Braverman was Attorney General, despite having a legal career about as illustrious as mine. I've never had a legal career, for new listeners. A strange state of affairs, to say the least, which is perhaps why so much focus is being put upon the ethnicity of the three holders of high office that aren't Liz Truss, the Home Secretary, the Foreign Secretary, and the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And I had a bit of a lesson, didn't I? Was it on Monday or Friday that we had a conversation about none of the four high offices of state being held by a white man? Can anyone remember? Does anyone pay attention to Monday? Monday. We're unanimous on that, are we, Keith? Unanimous. We are unanimous. And I had a real schooling, I have to be honest with you. I felt, and there was a very good reason why I did confine the conversation to people who aren't white, because I realised enough to know that our opinions don't really matter on this sort of thing. But I didn't realise just how unimpressed all of my callers would be by seeing their own ethnicity reflected in the upper echelons of government. I don't know if it counts as patronising or privilege or both or neither, actually, to give myself a break for once. But I just presumed that you can't be what you can't see might play a part. And look, just because every caller on Monday subscribe to a certain school of thought does not mean that everybody listening subscribes to the same school of thought, or everybody possessed of an opinion subscribes to the same school of thought. But I thought, in my perhaps naive, probably privileged, even white privileged way, I thought that the old argument, you can't be what you can't see, would at least play a role in opinion forming. So albeit that the three politicians of colour that we are speaking of, Cleverly, Kwarteng and Braverman, are not particularly representative of ethnic minority interests. I don't think any of them spoke out against a government-commissioned report that sought to deny the existence of systemic racism. I'll say that again because it still beggars belief. I don't think any of them spoke out. In fact, I think some of them spoke up for a government-commissioned report that sought to deny the existence of systemic racism. So they don't really speak for, what would you say, black issues. I don't know what any of them have said about the Black Lives Matter movement, but I doubt that they are badge-wearing, flag-waving supporters of it. And you have Priti Patel, who is a Home Secretary of colour, who actually essentially sided with the people booing the footballers taking the knee. So I don't know that many people would feel they were champions of racial equality, but they are black and or brown. And I thought naively that that would mean that black and brown people who didn't agree with a single political opinion they held would at least have a little bit of pleasure in the fact that somebody of that ethnicity could achieve that sort of job. You can't be what you can't see. So a young black girl looking at British politics and thinking there's no room for me in the highest echelons of government could look today at Suella Braverman and think actually there is. A young black lad thinking there's no room for me at top table in this country could look at Kwasi Kwarteng and think actually there is. And listen, I'm not going to lie to you. I never lie to you. I've still got a little scintilla of that sensibility lurking in the back of my brain, despite the fact that you gave it a right old kicking on Monday. And it will go, but Rome wasn't built in a day. You can't turn around. There is no point having a mind if you never change it, but you can't change it according to every gust of wind that blows in your direction. So I still have, and this I think is white privilege, I still have a sense that even though I find their politics repellent, there's something good in the fact that people of their ethnicity can get seats at top table. I think I need to get rid of that. But I could be wrong. And at this point in proceedings, I'm clinging on to it because of that very powerful phrase that, again, you taught me. You can't be what you can't see. You have to have role models or glass ceiling breakers or outliers to move the status quo, to shift the system. 10 minutes after 10 is the time. So I'll probably ask you that question a little later, but I'd like to ask you a trickier one first, if I may. And it is as much about Priti Patel, actually, as it is about her successor in the Home Office. And it's a really tricky one, this. I've never fully understood what identity politics means, because like most phrases that appear out of nowhere in media and political rhetoric, it seemed to me to be something that was designed to criticise or undermine a move towards equality or a concept of progress. I think it means that if you are of a certain ethnicity, then you should or you must be possessed of certain political opinions. So it almost means that your ideologies or your opinions are going to be at least in part defined by your identity, as in by the quiddity of you, by the what of you, not the what you've done, but the what you are. So for me, it wouldn't really apply, I don't think, because I don't think straight, white, privately educated men in this country, I don't think there is ever going to be a less oppressed class than straight, white, privately educated men. So I don't know what identity politics would mean in the context of someone like me. In the context of someone who belongs to any form of minority or oppressed community, that should have a bearing upon your opinions, up to the point where you deny that you're oppressed. You deny that you've ever been a victim of racism, and you may be telling the truth. At that point, identity politics falls apart, doesn't it? I think, as a lot of you are already telling me, some even with capital letters, that class is more important than ethnicity in many ways. Certainly, if you can afford to go to Eton, then although I believe you will encounter some treatment that white people wouldn't receive, you're not, and you're way ahead of, for example, a white kid growing up on a rundown council estate with no particular parental interest in their education, to claim that there is privilege that kid has when compared to an Eton-educated Chancellor of the Exchequer like Kwasi Kwarteng is a very tricky argument to make. My friend John Amaechi makes it best if you want to dig out his comments on the subject. But you can tell I'm not entirely sure about the question I'm going to ask you, but I think it's really important for two reasons. I'm hearing a hell of a lot of white right-wing people singing the praises of this cabinet's diversity. I'm not hearing many people of colour from unprivileged backgrounds singing the praises of this cabinet's diversity. And I don't think I'm supposed to say that out loud. I think part of the rhetorical clamp that is being put upon us is actually designed to silence criticism. Twitter is an interesting bellwether, but already I'm seeing some suggestion that, these lefties, they hate brown Tory women, for example, or something like that, which is a very clever propaganda tactic. You accuse your opposition of being exactly what you are, as in, the kind of people that might be all over Twitter sharing disgusting images, doctored images of Diane Abbott, are suddenly claiming that it's the lefties who really hate women of colour in politics. And that almost, and I think actually this happened a bit with Diane Abbott as well, it was used as a tactic to silence valid criticism. But I haven't seen any racist abuse of Suella Braverman. All I've seen is criticism. I haven't seen any misogynistic abuse of Priti Patel. All I've seen is valid criticism. I haven't seen any. I think some of the criticism of Therese Coffey today is misogynistic, actually. I think some of the language I've heard deployed to describe her health would not have been used to describe Ken Clarke when he was Secretary of State for Health. So I think there is some genuine misogyny going on with Therese Coffey, but there's no misogyny or racism going on with Suella Braverman or with Priti Patel previously. So here's the question, right? And it is a really tricky one. Look at Rwanda. Okay, look at the Rwanda scheme, which I think most people would agree is objectively disgusting. Certainly anybody who had relatively recent arrivals in this country on their family tree would feel that was a particularly pungent and disgusting policy, unless they were in the business of pulling up drawbridges or trying so hard to fit in that you end up being or professing opinions that essentially put you in the firing line. So think of the Rwanda scheme, the Rwanda deportation scheme, disgusting Rwandan deportation scheme. Is it wrong to think that politicians of colour who support the Rwandan deportation scheme are somehow worse than white politicians who do? That's the distillation of what I am somewhat clumsily trying to address this morning. Is there actually something wrong with, for example, believing that because Priti Patel is an Asian woman and the child of immigrants, then her attitude to immigration and deportation is even worse than it would be in the hearts and minds of a white politician? Is there even a bit of racism involved in that position, which I am pretty close to holding? I've got to be honest with you. I look at the story, I look at the behaviour, and I think that's odd. How can they be so anti-immigration? How can they be so pro-deportation when their own parents came to this country from overseas, some of them fleeing potential persecution? I have caught myself today and earlier this week wondering whether that's actually a slightly prejudiced position to hold. I look at politicians of colour supporting policies that I think come close to racism, and I feel a reaction within me that is a little bit different from the reaction I feel when white politicians do it. And I think that's probably wrong. But as ever, I'd rather find out what you think. Have I phrased the question clearly enough? Well, we'll find out, won't we, when we go to the phones in about 7 seconds' time. Have I phrased the question clearly enough? And again, I think that priority is given to non-white callers on this because it's about you, you know. It's about your ethnicity, actually, isn't it? As much as, well, more than mine. Do you feel, as a person of colour, that a politician of colour who seems to be a sort of Nigel Farage tribute act when it comes to, and don't forget that Priti Patel's dad stood for UKIP, is it wrong to feel that because in a truly, if you are committed to diversity, inclusion and equality, then you should have an identical attitude to politicians of colour who pursue policies you think are racist as you do to white politicians who pursue policies that you think are racist. There it is. That's the conundrum that I've been wrestling with since Monday. and the one that I want you to wrestle with today. And look, here is interactive phone-in radio in a blooming nutshell. Dave has texted already to say, can you repeat the question, please, James? I don't know if you're yanking my chain there, Dave, after my self-doubt a moment ago. And literally in the same second, they both arrived at 10:17 and 23 seconds. Awesome question, James. Really looking forward to this show. Conclusive proof, if it were needed, that you can never please all of the people all of the time. It is 21 minutes after 10 and you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Phil in Broadstairs has put the question that I'm dancing around today in such stark and unpleasant terms that you will understand why I'm dancing around it. He says, is it not prejudice on the part of white people to deny black people their inalienable right to hold repellent and racist views? That is kind of what I'm asking, actually, although you'll understand why I didn't put it quite as boldly as Phil. A pal of mine's been in touch already, actually, Keith, a different Keith, 2 Keiths under 40. Did I tell you I knew another Keith under 40? I see him at christenings every few years. He's a top bloke. He's got a car that you can open with your thumbprint. I've never seen that before. It's one of the coolest things I've ever seen. But when I got all excited about it, everyone else was like, yeah. We've known about that for ages. Anyway, he's a black guy, and he says, I find myself torn by this top-table ethnic squad that's been assembled. They don't represent me, and they have nothing in common with where I come from or what I'm about. I'm thinking that but you're all right racists, so the people who are possessed of racist views, but they're all right with their black mate, will point at these people and say, look, it must be all right. Your own people support it. But once any of them have a road to Damascus moment, the undercover and the overt racist will start rinsing them. They've drunk from the chalice and they need to take their licks either way. I think, to be fair to all of them, they take their licks. That goes with the territory in modern politics. 22 minutes after 10 is the time. But if you're a conservative of colour, you're not going to get anything like the sort of abuse that is either overtly or undercover racist that someone like Diane Abbott or David Lammy or Sadiq can't get. And that's an interesting element, possibly for a different conversation. Michaela is in Maidstone to kick things off. Michaela, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Good morning.
Hello.
I agree with what your friend Keith said. It's they don't represent. Kwasi Kwarteng doesn't represent me. His views doesn't represent me. I think he even said, he rejected that systemic racism exists in this country, and it's kind of like they reject their heritage, and it's kind of like an acceptance of the status quo, basically classism. They kind of deny the privilege of how they got to the position that they were in, whether their parents may have worked extremely hard.
Well, it's not a great phone line, Michaela, unfortunately. So I know. I don't know whether you've climbed a ladder or fallen down a well since you were talking to the producer. We'll try. We'll give it one more whirl. But I don't know that they're denying. He's not denying his background. His background is Eton College and Oxford University. Exactly,
and it's the privilege of how he got into the position that he is, and it's kind of like, well, I've been able to get here. Yes. Why can't you? And it's just infuriating, really, because it's like.
But is there no? I mean, this is kind of the conversation we had on Monday, and my still clinging to the notion that there's something in the "you can't be what you can't see" argument for young black lads looking at him being Chancellor and thinking, oh, look, black people can be Chancellor of the Exchequer. I still cling to the idea that there's a little bit of good in that.
And I agree with that sentiment to a degree, but what it kind of says to me is if you do want to be a black person who is in a prominent position, you have to deny racism. You have to make it, have these kind of views, conservative views, which kind of shows why maybe it's not as prevalent in Labour, because I just think politics in general is kind of unattainable for the working class people in general.
Maybe. I mean, I suppose Angela Rayner would be the role model there, or Wes Streeting, actually. They're both white. I'm going to nudge you to the difficult question about you personally, and whether if you see a politician of colour, whether it's a Priti Patel or a Suella Braverman or a Kwasi Kwarteng, supporting policies that are anti-immigration or pro-deportation or anti-refugee, and therefore, in the minds of many people, at least a little bit racist. do you have the same attitude to a politician of colour holding those views, supporting those policies, as you do to a white politician?
No, it's worse. It is worse.
Is it?
Because
well, then isn't that a bit? I mean, I'm not going to accuse you of racism, but aren't you judging people differently according to their skin colour?
Yeah, it is racism, but I'm not a person who's going to deny that racism and internalised racism isn't very prevalent in this country, and it does hurt more because you just feel like they're being used as well, and it's like you're trying. Like the fact that Priti Patel is being used as a face. Obviously, she was Home Secretary, but she's used as the face to bring in these abhorrent regulations and
policies. I hear you. The phone's gone. I can't. I'm going to move on because you've made your point brilliantly, but the phone line is wobbling again, and if it's irritating me in the studio, it's going to be much worse coming out of a transistor radio on a building site. Trish is in Shrewsbury. Trish, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello, Trish.
There's two levels to this. There's the macro, i.e., all people of colour will look at it and say, oh, right, okay. But the micro is that we don't identify as a person of colour with every black or brown person.
And it's patronising to presume that you do.
Absolutely. It's like not all white people identify with the Queen or the richest white person in Britain.
Yes.
You don't think, oh, I can pertain to being that person. I was telling your researcher that my mother she was Anglo-Indian, came from India, born in Calcutta, married my father, who was white Irish. Came over during 1947, partition, independence, blah blah blah. Yes. While she was in India, she had servants.
It's not blah, blah, blah. It's fascinating. Go on.
While she was in India, she had servants, and her servants would be Indian. Bearing in mind she was Anglo-Indian, of the British Raj, very British.
Yes.
When she came to England, she was shocked.
Yeah.
Not all white people had servants. She was shocked. She had to do her own cleaning, drew the curtains, cried. What's going on? Why haven't all white people lived like I remember when I was about 10, we were stood at a bus stop and there was myself, my mum, this white, blonde, young girl and an Asian man, and he was giving to this white girl. She swung on him and turned around and said, keep it out, shut your mouth.
Yes.
Know your place. In India, you would have been my servant.
Wow.
So, within all of that, there is still that class distinction. Now, the black community were even seen lower.
Yeah, what you're telling us, actually, is that it's not a black and white issue. It's not.
It isn't a black and white issue.
But we're going to run out of time, so I have to nudge you towards you personally. And if we pick on 3 or 4 policies, you look at the, whether it's booing the footballers, taking the knee, whether it's the demonisation of refugees and migrants in general, whether it's the Rwanda deportation policy, even the Shamima Begum issue, because I think if she'd been a white girl trafficked into a terrorist organisation, they wouldn't have been queuing up to take her passport away, to take her citizenship away. Do you feel differently towards an ethnic minority politician possessed of policies that some people think are racist than you do towards a white politician?
Again, I have to come out of the colour thing and look at it and say, I'm shocked that they continue to pay lip service to what they believe needs to be said and done.
But you can say that. I can't, I don't believe, say that. Because it's a huge criticism, isn't it?
Well, it is, and I can look at people like Priti Patel.
Yes.
I don't know this Suella, but
sure, you will.
Reading say that she's even more hard right than Priti Patel. I look at her and I think, really? Is that really what you believe, or are you playing lip service?
And so
are you pretending to be?
Yes.
Well,
we don't know, do we? We don't know, and I'm glad that you phrased it as a question rather than as an accusation, although you're perfectly entitled to make the accusation as well. I tied myself in knots on Monday when someone used the phrase Uncle Tom, but it's a free country. It's not a phrase I would use as a white bloke, and I don't think I should use as a white bloke, but I don't get to gatekeep about whether or not other people can use it. Thank you, Trish. What two amazing callers to start this conversation off. I must have got the question right, Dave. After all, and Keith, the other Keith, mate, he's 51, so you're still the only Keith in the country who's under the age of 50. 10:30 is the time. Dominic Ellis is here now with your headlines. It is 10:34 already. I've told you this a million times. I have no idea what time it is until I look at the clock sometimes. There's days when I get to 1:45 and I think we've only just drawn breath. There are other days I look up and it's 10:30 and I'm already shattered. So I was quite surprised to see it was 10:34. I feel we've only just got going and we could perhaps be halfway through this topic already. Or we may continue it into the second hour at the moment because it's PMQs at 12. God, even I sounded excited. I turned into Theo Usherwood temporarily. Theo will be joining us shortly. It's been a while, hasn't it, since we did our little kind of pre-match talk-up of PMQs, but it will be the first one in which Keir Starmer faces Liz Truss across the dispatch box. We've also now got the prospect on the horizon at an as-yet unspecified date, of Angela Rayner squaring up to Therese Coffey in the House of Commons. The two deputies will be doing PMQs. That could be quite entertaining as well. Topic I'm not going to do, because I don't think there is a way of doing it that's fair, is a lot of chatter about whether Therese Coffey's perceived poor health is pertinent to her new role as Secretary of State for Health. And I've asked myself, honestly, whether I'd be doing that as a phone-in topic if she was a man, and I don't think I would be. I could be wrong. I sometimes am. I even wrote a book about it. But I don't think we'll go there today. What I do like the idea of doing in the second hour is why on earth some of the most powerful people in the country, from newspaper editors to politicians, are so obsessed with Gary Lineker's Twitter account. I've followed Gary on Twitter for a long time, and he's actually quite good at it. I mean, credit where credit is due. He's got a lovely turn of phrase. He's got a cracking sense of humour, and he's very good at pricking the pomposity of people whose pomposity needs pricking. But it's not like national news. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily have... Well, you take my point. Why is it a subject of obsession everywhere from the House of Commons right through to the editorial floor of the Daily Mail? We shall possibly have a little look at that in the second hour. Ben's in Newcastle to steer us back to this question about, as the headlines just told you, the most diverse cabinet in history. But it's only diverse in one way, isn't it? If you're talking about hymn sheets, it's not diverse at all. Margaret Thatcher had people in her cabinet with whom she would disagree quite passionately on some subjects, most obviously off the top of my head, on state intervention in business, the thing that essentially brought the Westland the Westland saga to a head, the battle between Leon Britton and Michael Heseltine on whether or not the government should get involved in the future of a helicopter company called Westland. But there were ideological differences in her cabinet. I'm not seeing much diversity of hymn sheet in the current cabinet. So how important is the diversity of ethnicity? And how dangerous is it to find yourself arriving at a different conclusion about a politician's attitude to, for example, immigration, according to their colour? Because that is technically, I think, a form of racism. Ben's in Newcastle. Ben, what would you like to say?
Hi. As I've said before, I think racism... Well, if you've said it before, we don't need to hear it again, Ben. No, racism is everywhere.
Yes.
Every creed is racist against another.
Well, yes, but racism, fact, for the purposes of our conversation, will always involve the constituency of people that has the power in any given society. So racism is prejudice plus power. You're right to tell us that prejudice is everywhere, but it only becomes pertinent to conversations like this one if it's married to power.
Absolutely. However, in this case, all of them will pay lip service to the fact that there is no racism.
They seem to do that, don't they?
They do that, and they will say, oh, we don't want any more immigrants in, even though they are immigrants. I'm the son of an immigrant myself.
So do you look at them and the views you've just described differently from how you would look at the same views when espoused by a white politician?
No, I think of them as absolutely the same.
Right, that's healthier. I think that's healthier. I want to be like you. Do boo boo.
Yeah, they are actually doing the same thing. they're lying for a start.
Well, maybe.
No, but I actually am a little bit concerned about the maybe because...
Well, no, I'm just saying they might believe it. I think they probably do believe it, don't they?
Well, I don't think so. I think
there's too many immigrants in this country.
Points.
There's too many immigrants in this country. They believe that. There's too many people.
But actually, there is a lot less coming in. Most of the immigrants coming into this country actually are asked to come in.
I know that, and you know that. But I mean, people who so they're lying to appeal to people who are racist.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, all right. I'll give you that. They probably are, aren't they?
The outgoing Prime Minister did that himself without saying such.
He did. Why? How do you arrive at that place then where you see them equally? You see the possessors of these positions equally, whereas almost everyone else we've spoken to thinks that there's something worse. Because you mentioned there's immigration status yourself. You did mention that they were the children of immigrants, as if that did make it worse for them to hold these views about immigrants.
No, that's not what I meant. I meant that,
clearly.
That I'm in the same position as they are,
yes.
Except I'm not in a position of power. However...
no, I hear it.
Maybe...
Go on.
Sorry?
I hear what you're saying. I just wanted to clarify that one point, that idea that, I mean, it was more a reference to you being in the same category that they are in when it comes to your residency or citizenship or status in this country, and yet you hold the polar opposite view. Thank you, Ben. Rob's in Maidstone. 2 from Maidstone today. Rob, what would you like to say?
Hiya, James. So
Hello.
First I'm going to tell you off for lazy journalism.
What, again? What have I done now?
I'm sorry, but using the phrase identity politics in the way that the media use it.
Well, no, hang on. Did I? Well, you crack on with your ticking off, and I'll decide at the end whether or not I'm going to accept it.
Okay. So part of this issue is that we mix up correlation and causation.
Yes.
So when we look at large groups of whether it be black people, Catholics, Muslims, women, we get a set of data that tells us how that group normally operates.
Yes.
All right. Now that's normally seen as something that we can then use to define structural policies in our government.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you can't use it as a predictive model. You can't say an individual woman, Catholic, black person will hold these views and behave in this way.
No.
But what happens in media is they go, identity politics. That means that a black person can't have these views. No, it doesn't, because the underlying theory is about the use of big data versus small data and what that tells us about how things are done.
Got it.
So we just have to be really careful that then we can't say, when Priti Patel was in charge, she did X, Y, and Z, and she should have known better because she is a woman of Asian descent whose family left Uganda. Well, maybe most people who came from Uganda would hold the view that immigrants need support and help. Her particular family didn't.
Yeah.
So there's a set of influences on her that make her hold those views.
Yes.
So we have to be incredibly careful. So when we hear...
I'll take the early criticism, but I am being incredibly careful. That's the whole point of this topic, is being incredibly careful with exactly the conversation that you and I are now having.
Well, yeah, because when you then get people when people call in and they share their own experience, that's what they're sharing, their own experience. They are not a marker for the bigger group.
No, but I'm interested in what the bigger group thinks about the little group and whether they think differently about the little group with the same ethnicity compared to how they think about white people with the same opinions. I think that's the interesting question for me. And I don't think you should. I don't think you should. But as a white bloke, I don't think I should. I don't think it's my role to tell people of colour that they shouldn't either. And the only one so far was Ben, the last caller, who really does see the opinions equally regardless of who's holding them. Most people are going to think that the children of immigrants should have a more welcoming attitude to immigrants.
So then the question is why?
Empathy, because you should have even more empathy having actually gone through the experience yourself.
It depends on where your empathy sits.
I know it does. That's what we're having a conversation about. You're over-technicalising it now.
No, I'm not. Because
yes, you are.
I tend to agree with you as someone who's been an immigrant in another country and is in a minority group and does all these things. But what always concerns me is that in describing an individual experience, and trying then to extrapolate from that how others should think, behave, or be.
Yes, but we're not doing that. I'm fascinated to know how Priti Patel ended up being such a passionate advocate of the Rwandan deportation scheme. I would love to know what happened to her or her family in the past, or what it is that they achieved by denying the existence of systemic racism when it so obviously exists.
Yes, but then you see, that for me is a question about morality and interpretation.
Same.
Rather than anything to do with her ethnicity. Because her how do you morally...
No, the question doesn't change. You're right, the question is the same, but it becomes more interesting because of her ethnicity. Absolutely. It's the same question, I'm just more interested in the answer.
Well, so am I. So that's why it's important to hear the individualised stories.
Yeah.
Because that gives us the breadth of what's going on.
And so when Kemi Badenoch says, I've never been a victim of racism, that perhaps gives you an insight into why she doesn't think that racism exists.
Well, exactly. And then you look at her history and where her family came from and how they were set up in Nigeria and all those things. You go, well, I can understand why an individual might believe that.
I can too.
That doesn't excuse her in saying that, therefore, nobody else experiences this.
No.
And that's where that's where the government needs to be careful, because it needs to go, although we can't do causation for this, there is a correlation between people who are of this ethnicity or this religion or this sex and how things operate for them. And that's
what they're trying to deny. That's what they're trying to deny. So if you find 1% of a given constituency of people who deny the existence of a certain type of oppression, and you amplify that to the exclusion of the other 99%, then you are doing something awful. But that 1% might be acting authentically.
Absolutely.
Oh, you're good. I take the ticking off. Thank you. No, absolutely. That was that was wonderful. I loved that. I could feel the light bulb click on just sort of 10 seconds from the end of the conversation. Thank you, Rob. It's 10:45. 10:49 is the time. Amazing conversation, this. More than enough people keen to contribute to carry us well into the second hour. But I'm really drawn to another topic that I want to talk about as well, although it's nowhere near as important. It is to some people. It's the most important thing in town. Gary Lineker's Twitter account. Unbelievable. Tracy's been in touch to say I was effing depressed with this discussion, as usual, until Rob phoned in. Many of you need to go back and listen to Martin Luther King's speech. You're allowed to ring in yourself, Tracy, if you're unhappy with the direction of travel. But remember, a broad consensus emerged from callers, and I felt that Rob was more clarifying than correcting. You can have an authentic experience as a politician of colour. Kwasi Kwarteng is not, as some callers have suggested, necessarily being dishonest when he endorses a report or fails to challenge a report insisting that systemic racism doesn't exist. That may well be his experience, his authentic experience. But to take the authentic experience of one person from a certain background and inflate and amplify it to the exclusion of the opposite experience from the massive majority of people from the same background is a deeply sinister practice, and one which I believe this government is undertaking. I guess it's a form of gaslighting. Here is some even more help. James, you're so close to the dawning realisation, I think this tallies with what Rob just told us, that identity politics falls flat on its face in scenarios like these. It's not enough to tick an identity box and have your views elevated. Kwasi Kwarteng is black and went to Eton. Who is he more likely to represent? I can hear the cogs turning. Please just get there. I am bridling a little bit now at the warmth. The criticism, albeit warm criticism. I don't know that. I think possibly when I set the stall out in order to encourage you to talk to me, I possibly give a slightly false impression about where I am. I have no problem understanding that Kwasi Kwarteng, given his background, is more likely to represent interests that I have as a public school educated man than interests that you have as somebody growing up on a rundown council estate. So the cogs are turning, but I think I've got there. Perhaps not. Buki's in Barnet. But before that, another mate of mine's been in touch, Maurice McLeod, who you will have heard on the radio and seen on the television. Maurice is a chief executive of Race on the Agenda and a Labour councillor in Battersea Park. We were journalists together about 5,000 years ago, and he makes a point that I find hard to resist. He simply says, regardless of the politics of the people involved, and no matter what they actually do, at least they will change the country's idea of what a politician looks like, and that must be good in its own right. Buki's in Barnet. Buki, what would you like to say?
Hey, James, I think as a white guy, your hands are tied to some extent on what you can and can't say.
Yeah, and rightly so, I think. Rightly so.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as a black guy, obviously, I have a bit more freedom. There's a lot of angles you can come at this conversation. And I think what I'm really interested about is what you're speaking about. How do people of colour view the politicians of colour in these positions?
Yes.
I think where the pain comes from, and I'm going to be very specific, where the pain comes from people of colour, which other callers have touched on, sort of you have to get historic. And it's this idea of servitude and sort of slavery. And it's going back to the days when you had house N-words and you had field N-words. And it was this idea that those that lived in the house, people of colour, had more advantages, better clothes, better food. But in order to get those advantages, they essentially had to sell out their own people.
Right.
And so when you see a politician of colour in a position of power saying the things that some of them have said, i.e. sort of talking about immigration and the policies, the pain for black people and people of colour, it comes from an historical context because there's something really insidious and betrayal about it. And it's very difficult to push that aside and look at the pros and cons of the situation. These politicians have worked very hard. They've gotten themselves into a good position. Yes. And quite frankly, they're allowed to have whatever views they want. It's a free country.
Exactly that.
But when I'm stood there sort of listening to what they're saying, it's really hard to push away that historical, emotional pain and say to myself, well, it's okay for this black guy to have this opinion. Yeah. It's a free country.
It's head versus heart, isn't it, in a sense?
It's absolutely that. And I think...
God, how interesting.
I'm generalising here, so let's be careful.
Yeah.
Most people of colour find that historical pain unbelievably hard to deal with, and it's very hard to connect the head when that pain is so hard. And I think that's what hurts people of colour so much, and I think that is one of the main challenges in the discussion.
Yeah, and that is clearly you almost reluctantly admitting that your reaction to the same ideas is going to be different according to the ethnicity of the person holding them.
Well, I think it has to be to a certain extent. It's context. And I think on a good day, I can sit there and say this human being is welcome to any opinion they want. It's a free country.
Yeah.
How many good days I have, I don't know. But I think 9 times out of 10, I'm absolutely gutted that this black male or female or whatever is espousing these ideas, knowing full well. I mean, it's not sort of two people apart. It could be his cousin, it could be his sister, it could be his colleague, are probably going through some really challenging racial sort of situations. And it's, how can you sit here and say this, knowing full well that people you've grown up with, people you probably live with, are going through all these challenges? So it's not even so much a case of do we think we believe these politicians actually hold these views. It gets to a point where most people of colour are positive they don't hold these views at all.
Yeah.
To move aside such historical pain and such history, to then say, actually, I do really believe this, I'm not sure many humans are capable of that, and I think that's what's really challenging.
Wow. Yeah, crikey. Every day's a school day, but this one has been a real cloud clearer for me. And it's not simple, is it? It's not actually, I mean, as you've said, it can involve a form of emotional wrestling within your own heart.
Absolutely. It's not supposed to be simple, James, as you well know. Of course you do. It's not supposed to be simple. It's supposed to be nuanced, and it's supposed to be an intelligent conversation.
But in the hands of the Daily Telegraph and the Daily Mail, it is simple. Look, there's lots of politicians of colour in the cabinet, therefore you can't call us racist anymore, even as we espouse avowedly and demonstrably racist policies.
Well, of course, there are certain people who are pretty sure they figured it all out, but the rest of us are pretty sure we know absolutely nothing. You know what I mean?
I do know exactly what you mean. I forget which Greek it was who said the wise man is the man who appreciates how little he knows. Buki, thank you. I know more than I did before you rang in. 10:56 is the time. It's coming up to 10:57. Danielle's in Bournemouth. Danielle, what would you like to say? We haven't got ages.
Okay, hello, James. I've been told to speak slowly by your researcher because I speak too quickly, so I'll do my best. So I feel passionate. So you started this really interesting discussion about, black, it's a black and white issue, and then you did say, it's not just a black and white issue. So I just want to put my view here. I'm Jewish, secular Jew, assimilated, about third generation. And I think if you speak, and not all Jewish people will feel this way, but the refugee issue is a really, really big point. It really resonates with Jewish people. Yes. And if there was a Jewish member of parliament or a cabinet member who espoused and supported the views of this current cabinet and the policies they want to introduce, it would make me very, very sad and embarrassed that they were Jewish. And I wouldn't understand how a Jewish person, knowing the history we have, a little bit like the previous speaker was speaking about the history, could not have empathy and understanding and want to introduce, ethical refugee policies that also, align to international law. Well, and so it's not just a black and white issue. I just wanted to make that point, which I'm sure you appreciate.
I do.
Really, really important to Jewish people.
Yeah, no, I understand that. And yet it's slightly at odds with what some other callers have said, isn't it, about the importance of being, if you like, blind to background on these sort of issues.
You can't be.
You can't. Other callers can.
I can't. No, of course, absolutely, of course. No, and that's the point. Is that there isn't a one view of this. Of course, there isn't.
I'm thinking while you speak about Tom Tugendhat. I don't know. I'm pretty sure that one of his forebears came over on the kinder transport.
So. Yeah, that's right.
And he's now in the cabinet. So
absolutely, and I struggle with that.
Right.
I struggle. So
because the kinder transport would be criminalised under the current government's approach to refugees. I'm sure that I'm sure it wouldn't, for what it's worth. If a genuine kinder transport was happening now, I'm sure that they'd create a loophole. But as things stand, that passage into this country would currently be illegal. But as we've seen with Ukraine, they could open up a legal passage, but it would currently be illegal. And if they got here, they'd be on the plane to Rwanda.
That's right. So for Jewish people, just the whole issue of refugees is an interesting one for us.
Well, for you as a Jewish person, you can't speak for... No,
I can't speak for all Jewish people, thankfully. No. I don't want to speak for all Jewish people because I'm not, I'm a very individual type of Jew.
Well, exactly.
Who eats bacon, what can I tell you?
Gosh.
But,
it's all coming out now. It's all coming out now, Daniel.
It's all coming out. But all I'm saying is, James, that, it is a complex issue, but I struggle with Jewish people that don't have more empathy for refugees.
Right,
and I struggle with Jewish politicians who are in a position to influence policy and law but don't bring that level of empathy and understanding to it. Because you can't you can't not be Jewish.
Well,
you can't not be Jewish.
Well, certainly if the SS were doing their rounds, then
as David Baddiel said,
you would be Jewish. Although Tugendhat, the politician we're talking about, is a Roman Catholic. His paternal grandfather was an Austrian Jewish emigrant from Vienna, who I'm pretty sure came over on kinder transport because oh Lord, what's Alf's name? What's Alf's surname? Lord Dubbs. Alf Dubbs. Dubbs, not Dobbs. Dubbs. I'm pretty sure that Tom's granddad stood against Alf Dubbs in the City of London seat and won as a Conservative. So two children of the kinder transport in this country standing for different political parties in an election. I think that's a beautiful story, a beautiful example of inclusion and diversity. But as you remind us, we, in many ways we've gone backwards since then, because under the current law, the kinder transport would be criminalised under Priti Patel's policies, and presumably under Suella Braverman's as well. Although I do personally believe that they'd find that they would open up a passage in the way that we have done for Ukrainian refugees, but not, of course, for refugees from countries where the skin colour of the very diverse cabinet is more common than it is in Ukraine. 11:01 is the time. 4 minutes after 11 is the time. We'll move on from that conversation with apologies to Mark and Colette and Rajdev, Alan, Nigel and others. Not that Nigel. But I suspect we'll be returning to similar territory sooner rather than later, because it is a fascinating subject to me. And speaking of diversity, my colleague Ben Kentish has just tweeted the new cabinet breakdown by schooling. 5 comprehensive school students or pupils there, 3 grammar school and 23 private school. So diversity or not, you tell me. Interesting that, isn't it? And, I'm pretty open about the fact that I attended private school myself, so don't think that I'm making too much of a meal about that, but it is not what you would call diverse. Just the last word on it. Peter says, very brave of you to discuss the topic of race. Please discuss the question of whether Rishi's colour had a significant bearing on his defeat or not. Go on, I dare you, says Peter. Why would you be daring me? Is it because a bunch of idiots went after my colleague Sangeeta Maiska when she addressed this issue at the weekend, including a bloke who rejoices in the title senior contributor to GBB's, a fella that used to work as a chief of staff to Ian Duncan Smith and still gets paid for his opinions on modern politics. Tim Montgomery is his name. Is that why I'm supposed to be wary of wading in on that? I possibly got the wrong fella there, Peter. I had a look at the weekend at some of the Facebook groupings of people who purport to be Conservative members, and there was a conspiracy theory doing the rounds that Indian people who weren't actual residents of this country were joining the Conservative Party in their droves in order to propel Rishi Sunak into Downing Street. And listen, how representative they were or how many of them they were, but there were certainly people expressing the view that having an Indian Prime Minister, Peter, would be absolutely awful. And I think we could all agree that someone possessed of that toxic racist view is more likely to lean to the right than the left, and someone who is more likely to lean to the right than the left is more likely to vote Conservative and possibly even be a Conservative member. So I'm sure it played a part, but quite probably not a decisive part. Unless I've misunderstood your question and there is a trickier issue that you would like me to address. 6 minutes after 11 is the time. We move on now to a madness, a form of madness. I'm going to read you something from the front page of the Daily Mail, which has gone absolutely tonto now. I mean, it is... I mean, I can't be bothered, frankly, but I wish somebody would put together the front pages that they've done over the last 6 years with the 4 different prime ministers. I presume they were tooting their little horn for David Cameron at one point, weren't they? Insisting that he must win and not Ed Miliband, the man. How did they describe Ed Miliband's dad? The man who hated England or something like that? So the fanfare with which every Conservative Prime Minister is greeted by the newspaper, which conveniently ignores the fact that the last person that they gave an enormous fanfare to has been hounded out of office either in disgrace, like Boris Johnson, or in disarray, like Theresa May, or in disgust, like David Cameron. It's quite incredible. But here you go. This is actually on the front page of the country's best-selling newspaper. How the left-wing Twitterati crowed as the heavens opened just before Liz Truss arrived in Downing Street for her big speech. Then, in a moment loaded with cheering symbolism, the skies cleared and our new PM declared, together we can ride out the storm. I don't know how long I'm going to have to do this for, but they've just nicked Joe Lycett's joke. Again, haven't they? They've ripped off Joe Lycett. That is exactly the front page that Joe Lycett would have written while pretending to be a, quote, very right-wing, end quote, idiot. How the left-wing Twitterati... Do these people do anything except follow the Twitter accounts of people they profess to despise? It must be such a sorry existence. What are you doing at work today? I'm following James O'Brien and Owen Jones on Twitter to find out what it is that they've got to say about the weather. You're doing what? I'm following James O'Brien and Owen Jones on Twitter to find out what they've got to say about the weather. How the left-wing Twitterati crowed as the heavens opened just before Liz Truss arrived in Downing Street for her big speech. Then, in a moment loaded with cheering symbolism, the skies cleared and our new PM declared, together we can ride out the storm. Oh boy, it'd be funny if we didn't have to live here, wouldn't it? That's absolutely incredible. Who are you picking a fight with today, lads? People on Twitter who are laughing about the fact that it's raining and Liz Truss has got to give a speech in a minute. It stopped raining. Hallelujah, that'll teach them. It's like the most bizarre fight between people who aren't fighting and people on the other side who are like the lion in the woods. Put 'em up, come on, put 'em up, put 'em up. That's what they're like. They're like the cowardly lion. No one's fighting you. It would have been quite funny if a Prime Minister was delivering a speech in the pouring rain. It was quite funny that they had to put a bin bag on the podium. It was just funny. It's a left-wing Twitterati crow. These people are going to give themselves an embolism if they're not careful. But it did attract my attention because a Daily Mail quotes journalist, end quotes, decided to, or attempted to, pick up something I was doing on Twitter last night, and it didn't go well for him. I think it's fair to say. He's one of the ones that spends his entire life writing bilge about how dreadful Meghan Markle is. But, you know, it's a living. And this idea of why they all hate Twitter so much is not something I've turned my attention to before. I told you they ran a news story when Elon Musk announced that he was going to buy Twitter. They ran a news story counting how many followers people like me had. And they actually ran a news story saying, O'Brien lost 200 followers yesterday. It was frankly bizarre. And then they had lots of right-wing people and a few racists, I think, thrown in there as well, who for some reason saw their follower numbers go up when Elon Musk announced he was going to buy Twitter. That was why are they so obsessed with Twitter? I know the answer to that question. And it only came to me last night when I was watching what happens to a Daily Mail journalist when they try to pick a fight with someone who's got a massive platform that hasn't been paid for by a non-dom billionaire. They hate Twitter, these people, because it actually gives a huge platform to people who can speak truth to power. They can't get their head around it. Imagine if you spent your day doing the bidding of Viscount Rothermere and Paul Dacre while calling yourself a journalist, and you go on Twitter and you find some no-mark with a radio show who's got 1 million followers. They've got more followers on Twitter than these newspapers have readers. It drives them absolutely potty because they can see the writing on the wall. That's why they were so delighted when Elon Musk announced he was going to buy Twitter, because they think he's right-wing and they thought he might somehow be able to close down all these people actually telling the truth about stuff and potentially undermining the gaslighting that they do on a daily basis. So it only came to me yesterday why they're so obsessed with Twitter. It was the weirdest thing that's ever happened to me in a newspaper. I have to be honest with you. I didn't believe it when a mate messaged me to tell me, have you seen this? I said, oh, shut up. He said, no, seriously, they're writing a news article about the fact that you've lost Twitter followers. So a couple of hundred, despite having, at the time, I don't know, 900 and odd thousand. I'm over 1 million now, you'll be delighted to learn. That should be front page news, right? If me losing 200 Twitter followers is worthy of a news story in the Daily Mail, me hitting 1 million should be on the front page. O'Brien hits 1 million, a nation rejoices, or something like that. I don't know. But that's why they're so obsessed with it, and I'm so sorry that it took me so long to work it out. I really am. Oh, someone's done the front. No, that's the Express, not the Mail. Only Cameron can save Britain. Vote May or we face disaster. Down but not out. Why we must put faith in Boris. Put faith in trust to deliver for Britain. You couldn't make it up. That's the Express, which is like the kind of dweeby little brother of the Daily Mail. And it took, I apologise, wasn't I? I don't do it very often, so I'll do it again with feeling. I am so sorry that it took me so long to work out why they are so obsessed with the Twitter accounts in particular of people who disagree with them. It's because it's a platform. They're fine if you're writing for The Guardian, nobody reads it. We're pretty much frightened the BBC into acquiescence now. People like Mateless have to leave the BBC in order to tell the truth about simple stories or to call liars liars. We've got them on the run, but we can't do anything about, Twitter. We've set up some television stations now where various sort of misfits and rejects from proper outlets can all have their own shows to talk about how wonderful Boris Johnson is or what a great bloke Nigel Farage is. We've got our own TV stations now, but we can't do anything about Twitter. Twitter. Millions of people on it, just making us look stupid by telling the truth about stuff that we lie about every day. That's why they hate Twitter. Oh, glad I finally worked it out. But why do they hate Gary Lineker's Twitter so much? Gary Lineker, arguably the greatest footballer of his generation, or most successful footballer of his generation. I'm not doing a football phone-in, but he won a Golden Boot at a World Cup. No one's done that. I don't think even... Did Jeff Hurst do that? I don't think even Jeff Hurst did that because Jimmy Greaves was playing in a lot of the earlier rounds, wasn't he, in '66? And a very good television presenter. I say that as someone who has presented television programmes. It's not as easy as they make it look. You know, auto cue is a nightmare sometimes. If it goes too fast or too quickly, you can end up in a right old gobbledygook. And of course, football involves quick wits in the studio and keeping people like Roy Keane in check. I couldn't do that. I'm not sure anyone can keep Roy Keane in check. So a very, very successful footballer turned hugely successful broadcaster who confines his BBC work to sport. Why are so many people, from the editor-in-chief of the Daily Mail right through to a character I came across yesterday called Steve Brine, why are they so obsessed with Gary Lineker's activity on Twitter? That's the question I'm going to ask you, actually. And we're going to broaden it out, I think, into, we'll have a look at Joe Lycett as well. We'll have a little listen to what happened in the Select Committee yesterday. But why? I bet you've never thought about this before. Even if you are a bit gammony and you're going, oh, it's outrageous, he shouldn't be doing this and he should. Why not? He's a sports presenter. He's a football presenter. Why shouldn't he be able to tweet whatever the hell he wants? Recipes, political opinions. Down with sewage is his most controversial tweet of late. That's what's got all the Tory knickers in a twist. Gary Lineker cross about sewage and the fact that pretty much every Conservative, not every Conservative, but almost every Conservative in the House of Commons voted against the idea of making companies do a hell of a lot more to stop all the shocking amounts of sewage being pumped into our seas. Why? Hit the numbers now. You really will get through. I think Eusebio won the Golden Boot in 66. I didn't say he'd won a World Cup, Rob. Honestly, you divot. You've got to pay attention if you're going to start texting in. I said he won a Golden Boot at the World Cup. So if you're a bit stupid and you did think that Gary Lineker shouldn't be tweeting stuff, give me a ring and tell me why. 0345 606 0973. I promise I won't actually call you stupid. Maybe you're not stupid. But if you've never thought about this before, think about it now. Why are they so obsessed with Gary Lineker's Twitter account? I'm not sure I know. I know the bloke. Why? He doesn't know. Why are they so obsessed with Gary Lineker's Twitter account? Now, forget about everybody else for the moment. I just want you to answer that question. And you can do it from the perspective of it's right that they're obsessed with it. It's outrageous that Gary Lineker is tweeting about sewage. But you're going to have to make a stronger case than anyone I've come across has managed to make so far. Why on earth are they so obsessed with Gary Lineker's Twitter account? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. Hit the numbers now. You will get through. I don't know if this one's going to work. It's a weird one, isn't it? But not as weird as the obsession, which we are seeking together to understand. 19 minutes after 11 is the time. I'm just having a little look at the CV of Steve Brine, the politician to whom we will turn our attention shortly. He did actually lose the Conservative whip in 2019 because he supported the Benn Act, which was, of course, designed to prevent a no-deal Brexit. So fair play to him for that. Makes me feel slightly uncomfortable sharing the line I'm about to share next. There is only one thing worse than successful journalists who go into politics, and that is unsuccessful journalists who go into politics. Prior to his political career, Brine worked as a BBC radio journalist and in public relations, which perhaps explains why he is so furious with the BBC. Who would want to be a Conservative MP when they could be a hugely successful radio presenter? Answer, nobody, really. Can't think of anyone off the top of my head. But there you go. It is what it is, and he's making the best of it. And he was in Select Committee yesterday talking to the chairman of the BBC, Tim Davie, in terms that are frankly staggering. This is Parliament, parliamentary business. It's a Select Committee where the obsession that the editor-in-chief of the Daily Mail and the editor of the Daily Telegraph and all of them have with Gary Lineker's Twitter account has now, by a process of ludicrous osmosis, infiltrated the seat of government itself. Absolutely breathtaking. Have a listen to this.
I've talked to Gary. I think he was doing thousands of tweets, and I think overall the behaviour, in terms of where he is, I think he's in a lot better state. He is not at the standard of a news and journalist. He shouldn't be as a news and current affairs executive. But overall, I think that conversation goes on. I'm very supportive of Gary. I think he's a brilliant presenter. And I think it is work in progress in terms of where he draws the line. But we've had a good conversation. I think he understands the guidelines. But I'm not...
When you had that conversation, does he say, okay, yeah, let's do this then, Tim, let's go through this, let's tick this box? Or does he sort of say, yeah, I've screwed up again? I mean, we're paying Gary £1.35 million. I mean, he's down 10 grand on last year, but I'm sure he'll get by when his energy bill comes in. But, I mean, we're paying him 1.35 million quid, and he's a brilliant pundit on football.
He is, yeah.
And he's entertaining.
He is.
I don't care what he thinks about water quality. Why should we be paying him? My constituents
don't follow him on Twitter then, you complete doofus.
If they don't pay it, they go to prison for somebody to give their opinion on water quality.
Well, with respect, you're not paying him to
but he's doing
tweet.
it.
And I think he is, my view is that overall, if you look in the round, I think people are smart enough to see this, look at this sensibly. I think Gary and I have had conversation that says, and I think he's seen a massive improvement to where he was a few years ago in terms of his entry into party politics. I think that banning people completely from getting to any issues-based tweeting is probably the wrong position to do, but there's a standard there. We talk about it. I'm very supportive of him.
Tim Davey there, the chairman of the BBC, speaking to the Select Committee on Digital Culture, Media and Sport. Do you want to know how stupid Steve Bryan is? I mean, this is spectacular stupidity. It's quite incredible, and thanks to another pal of mine who's a sporting legend for pointing this out, Brian Moore, a former scourge of front rows across the northern and southern hemispheres. So, since becoming an MP, Steve Bryan has tweeted about football. Yeah, can you see the problem here? So Gary Lineker is paid to present football programmes on the BBC. Stupid Steve Bryan somehow thinks that he's actually being paid to tweet his opinions about sewage. Shall I share some of the opinions that stupid Steve Bryan is upset about? Liz Truss will be Prime Minister, and the fourth in 6 years, they appear to be following the Watford FC policy. I'll explain this joke to Keith. Watford changed their manager a lot. Right? So that's why that is funny. I'm not claiming Gary Lineker is Eric Morecambe, by the way, by any stretch of the imagination, nor would he. Here is the offensive tweet. This is what offended stupid Steve Bryan, who, despite being paid by taxpayers to be an MP, has tweeted about football. I'll even read you the tweet in a minute. As a politician, how could you ever, under any circumstances, bring yourself to vote for pumping sewage into our seas? Question, which you're welcome to answer. Unfathomable, he says. Again, possibly a pun on fathoms. Again, he's not exactly Eric Morecambe, is he? So that's what stupid Steve Bryan is upset about. And then, because I am something of a Twitter Jedi, I'll find for you now the example of stupid Steve Bryan tweeting about football. So this is how stupid he is. Unbelievable scenes at Old Trafford. Liverpool are very good and Man United are very poor right now. But in my opinion, the Premier League has a problem. There are really only 3 teams who can win this league, which is only one better than a very Scottish kind of situation. No, me neither, frankly. Absolute gibberish. But he did it while an MP. Oh, Lord, I've just noticed that he follows me. I'm sure that situation will be changed momentarily. So, Gary Lineker, who is not paid to tweet, he is paid to present football programmes. When he's not working, he tweets, including tweets like, as a politician, how could you ever, under any circumstances, bring yourself to vote for pumping sewage into our seas? Shouldn't be doing that, apparently, because his salary comes out of licence fee payment. However, Steve Bryan, whose salary comes out of the public purse, is tweeting about football on just last year. What a muppet! I mean, that level of idiocy you would need to think, well, I'm going to tweet about football despite being an MP, but someone who is a football presenter shouldn't be tweeting about politics. It's hilarious, right? So why do they care so much? His brain is so boiled that he doesn't realise how stupid he's been rendered. And I think he's been rendered this stupid by the Mail and the Telegraph and the media coverage, the obsession with Gary Lineker's Twitter account. More clips or calls? I'm going to consult with the producer. Hang on. I'm going to do a call now. Alan is in Stourbridge. Alan, what would you like to say?
Hello, James.
Hello.
It's about platforms, really, isn't it? Like, when it comes down to brass tacks, like, they can quite clearly see that someone like Gary Lineker and someone like yourself and Jet Lycett have got a platform that people.
I'm a very, even with my ego, mate, I'm going to have to say I'm a very distant third in that little triangle of left-wing Twitterati. I don't think I'm up there with Lycett or Lineker, not by a long chalk, but carry on.
Fair, but you've dipped your toes in the water, shall we say. So yeah, Lineker's got a huge platform. He speaks to people not only like on his Twitter account, but on the TV and any other kind of media appearances that he may choose to do in his career. And as a consequence, people are more likely to listen to him, both for his football commentary as a distinguished footballer and presenter, but also they're probably going to go, well, if I trust him on this, I'll probably trust him on that. And I think that's where the Tories have a problem.
So they're terrified of the truth.
Well, not just so much the truth, but they probably just think he's a class traitor because even in that clip that you played, they mentioned the salary that he's on. In his salary bracket, he should be one of them. He should be a, right wing, I've got loads of money, I should look after myself. But Gary Lineker, coming from where he's come from, is like, well, actually, no, I'd rather just live in a decent country with actual clean water going, and all that kind of stuff. And they realise that for some, like, they don't have that same level of clout. No one, because they've not said anything of any substance, of any value in years. They've just torrented the same usual Tory stuff, whereas Gary Lineker has at least shown that he's able to move on his position and he's quite malleable when it comes to new ideas. So that's why they focus on people.
So they're frightened of him?
In a sense, I suppose, because they're aware that people pay attention. Whereas with the Tories, they're like, well, what you say, oh, it's the same old stuff. The same old either racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, biphobic. It's all that usual stuff. Whereas Gary Lineker's like, oh,
it's football. He's one of the boys. He can't be coming out with this stuff. How can we pretend that they're all out of touch metropolitan elites if it's actually the most successful footballer of his generation turned superlative footballing broadcaster? The patronising bilge we serve up about the working class is going to get blown out of the water if this lad from Leicester continues to point out what a bunch of vampires we all are.
Exactly.
Could be that. It's a persuasive analysis, Alan. The level of obsession, though, can you explain that?
Because they've got nothing of substance to do themselves, have they? Like, they've just been, 12 years of the same old kind of, actually not even same old, it's been worsening progressively, whereas, at least Gary Lineker entertains people, if nothing else. They can't even entertain people. They can't even acknowledge that people might want to have more than just the one thing that people are doing. Like the Tories are trying to shove people like that are performers or communicators of any kind. You exist in this box and that's it. If you get outside
but
of
Andrew
that,
Neil is allowed to publish The Spectator. They don't have a problem with that. He can publish a magazine that routinely gives Enoch Powell a run for his money when it comes to some of the rhetoric that's in there. They're absolutely fine with that. But Gary Lineker can't tweet about sewage.
Yep, boys club, innit?
Well, and Neil, of course, was presenting political programmes on the BBC,
Absolutely.
while Lineker presents footballing programmes. It is one of those issues that just the closer you get to it, the more, frankly, bizarre and outstanding it becomes. So you can publish the most right-wing organ in the country while presenting a political programme, but you can't tweet about sewage or take the mickey out of Tories when presenting the football. That's the worldview of the Daily Mail, the Daily Telegraph and stupid Steve Bryan.
Yes. I would go as far as to say, if you looked at the numbers of engagement with those publications and those programmes versus the level of engagement of Gary Lineker's programmes and publications and tweets and whatever else he puts out into the world, I think you will realise exactly why they are going after him. It's all to do. He's making how much money a year in salary? Fair play to him, but
bit of jealousy there. People who object to right wing rhetoric shouldn't be wealthy. That's the old champagne socialist nonsense, isn't it?
Yep.
If you haven't got any money, it's the politics of envy. If you've got a few quid, it's champagne socialism. Literally nobody is allowed to criticise the status quo.
Absolutely.
And he is quite good on Twitter as well. I wonder if that's part of it. And, I always say that some of the sort of old cheeses at the Daily Mail have a begrudging admiration for anyone who can speak to women. The fact that Lineker's quite good at Twitter and they all don't get it possibly boils their proverbial as well. 31 minutes after 11 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Dominic Ellis is here now with the headlines. 33 minutes after 11. I'm going to rename him. I think stupid's a bit harsh, is it? Or not? Oh, don't all at me now to say carry on. I'll call him Silly Steve Bryan. So he's got his pants in a bunch about Gary Lineker's Twitter account because Gary Lineker tweets about politics while being paid from licence fee cash. But Steve Bryan tweets about football while being paid from taxpayers' cash. Brian Moore pointing that out in a similar style to how he used to play rugby. He writes, quoting the fella back at him, Silly Steve back at him, "I and millions of taxpayers don't pay you to tweet on football." And there he is tweeting about football. So why did they get so upset about it? And I think Alan in Stourbridge, it'll be the Bathams, Alan in Stourbridge speaking some serious sense there. But it's not just football. A lot of you saying, do you think Steve Bryan would have a problem with Gary Lineker's tweets if they were supportive of the Conservative Party? No, and there is a beautiful snapshot of the British media. Imagine if a BBC presenter tweeted, cautious support for the Countryside Alliance or the Conservative Party or Liz Truss, or something that could be construed as supportive, or criticism of the Labour Party. That would be easier to do. Why is no one asking about Keir Starmer's curry? Question mark, exclamation, laughing emoji, meh. Where would that kick off? This is actually much more interesting than I realised. So there you've got it. Let's say that I don't want to pick on an actual real person now because it probably isn't fair. But I'm going to use Greg Wallace because he seems quite a thick-skinned fella. Imagine if Greg Wallace, a BBC presenter, started tweeting something mildly critical of Keir Starmer. Right? Not non-news and current affairs. So, you know, he does food stuff. Where would that explode? What Labour MPs would get their knickers in a twist about Greg Wallace criticising Keir Starmer? Who in a select committee would dedicate important time to Greg Wallace's Twitter account? Which Labour MP would do that? I don't think any of them would. Where in the British media would Greg Wallace's mild criticism of... Greg Wallace, as far as I know, has never criticised Keir Starmer, but I have to use a real person to make the story work. Sorry, Greg. Where in the British media would there be a hoo-ha, a brouhaha, a Ferrari? Where in the British media would there be a Ferrari if Greg Wallace criticised Keir Starmer? Nowhere. That's how mad this media ecosystem has become. And remember, it's not mad enough for them because now they're setting up their own TV stations as well, where no one would ever mention the fact that Greg Wallace had criticised Keir Starmer, but everyone will be having kittens about the fact that Gary Lineker has criticised politicians, unspecified politicians, who voted to pump sewage into our seas. It's crackerjack, isn't it? Absolutely crackerjack. So why are they so obsessed with Gary Lineker's Twitter? And it's not just Gary Lineker's Twitter. Here's silly Steve Bryan talking about a soap opera.
EastEnders. One of my favourite shows. This is a bit of a get out of my pub moment. Well, Brexit was likened to COVID. After being shown chucking a glass of water into Sam Mitchell's face, Sharon Watts aggressively told her, "We've had Brexit and COVID. We don't need you here."
What? I mean, seriously, what? I can't swear on the radio, but what the flip? This is Parliament. This is the House of Commons. The cost of living crisis over there, energy bills over there. Have a listen to it again, because honestly, I think someone spiked my tea with magic mushrooms.
EastEnders. One of my favourite shows. This is a bit of a get out of my pub moment. Well, Brexit was likened to COVID. After being shown chucking a glass of water into Sam Mitchell's face, Sharon Watts aggressively told her, "We've had Brexit and COVID. We don't need you here."
Okay. I mean, hello? Nurse? How do you even respond to that? This poor fellow. I mean, I think he's a Tory. Is he a Tory donor, Tim Davie? He's certainly got links to the Director General, not the Chairman. I forget the details, but let's just find out. How do you respond to that sort of gibberish? EastEnders, a storyline in a soap opera, conveyed the idea that a fictional character thought Brexit was a bad idea. That's outrageous. So outrageous, I'm going to dedicate time at the Select Committee for Digital Culture, Media and Sport to tearing a strip off the Director General of the BBC about the professed opinion of a fictional character in a fictional pub. Good. I wouldn't know what to say to him. What did Tim Davies say?
I think in drama it is a real kind of question on that, because I think characters offering... That's not... Sharon is not the views of the BBC, by the way. We can debate that at length. but I think that... And it's important that you get drama from different perspectives, different writers, all of that. But I don't think... It depends on the context of that view and how it's offered. I don't think that... I think that is a different example.
Sharon Watts or Mitchell, I don't know. She's probably got married again since I used to watch EastEnders. Hello, Princess. Sharon Watts does not convey the views of the BBC. A grown man had to say that. A grown man had to say that. The Director General of the BBC, oh my Lord. Lord Leith would be just rocking in his grave at the moment. The Director General of the BBC had to say out loud in public to a serving politician, Sharon Watts does not convey the opinions of the BBC. A fictional barmaid, landlady, crikey. She probably isn't even. Is she still there? I don't know. Who cares? It's not real. Silly Steve Bryan. God knows what he made of Joe Lycett. Shall we find out?
And then Laura Kuenssberg, bringing us right up to date on Sunday. So Laura, who is a fantastic journalist, and I would say fairly unimpeachable on impartiality, actually, in knowing her, watching her, and knowing her personally.
Agreed.
But I would say that her show got off to a challenging start in terms of major appeal outside of SW1 and on this whole issue of impartiality by the Joe Lycett debacle, where he was asked on as a pundit. He did this mock applause after Liz Truss left the interview chair, was then immediately asked for his reaction, and he said she was the dregs of what they've got available and the backwash of the available MPs. Now, whatever your opinion, my colleagues around this table, whatever my opinion of people in my party, not really relevant, but for a brand new show, which really wants to get off to a good start, when you're booking a pundit to go on, Joe Lycett is not an uncontroversial figure. You talk about the conversations that go on after output. How about a conversation that goes on before output, where somebody says, you know what, new show, new start, new term, let's not book Joe, because we know what Joe's going to deliver. You see, somebody who's ungenerous, the BBC could say, you knew exactly what Joe was going to deliver, and that's why you booked him.
So one question is, why was it so funny when Joe Lycett said that Liz Truss was brilliant and that she'd been perfectly clear? It's only funny because it's not true. If Liz Truss had been brilliant and perfectly clear, and if she came across as an impressive politician, and Joe Lycett did some quotes comedy describing her accurately, it's only funny because it's true, if you see what I mean, or not true. And that is a real-life politician in the United Kingdom in 2022, pumping sewage into our seas, energy bills out of control, cost of living crisis on the horizon, and this fella is, man alive. Anyway, again, Greg Wallace, the stuff I made it up. Greg Wallace has never done that. I think Prue Leith is a Brexiter, isn't she? So, mother of a Conservative MP. I know that's on Channel 4 now, Bake Off, but did anyone kick off about that? No. Where in the British media would you have a brouhaha? Even I wouldn't go. Even I couldn't be bothered. I think absolutely ridiculous that Andrew Neil was allowed to publish The Spectator while supposedly obeying the impartiality rules at the BBC as a presenter of flagship political programmes. But if a presenter of a food programme or a sport programme wanted to tweet something warm about the Conservative Party or critical of the Labour Party, who would give a fig? They're mad, these people. Why do they care so much about Gary Lineker's Twitter account? Shane's in Winchester. Shane, what have you got?
Hi, lovely to speak to you. I've got 2 points. One, I watched a YouTube video by Steve Bryan when Richie Sunak visited Winchester, so I think it might be one thing might be a personal problem is the fact that his family are Spurs fans. So that
listen, I'm not paying you to talk about football, Shane. All right.
I dislike football, but I watched it, and his family are Spurs fans. But it's also the fact that Gary Lineker's fact that he is into football will reach a lot of people that aren't engaged in politics.
Yes.
Or think about politics. So he's talking to people that would not normally care about anything but might read something on the Sun newspaper and go, oh my God, that's disgusting. We need to vote Tories to make sure this doesn't happen. And if he's arguing a different point that goes against that, they're going to hear it.
So again, it's the idea that he's going to reach parts that other political pundits or even politicians don't reach, and that's why they're so upset. They're terrified of him. They're terrified of Gary Lineker's tweets. People who use snowflake as an insult and call everybody else woke because apparently they're too sensitive. They're terrified of Gary Lineker's tweets.
Yeah, because he reaches people that wouldn't normally.
I think you must be right. Do they realise this? Do you think if silly Steve Bryan was here and we said, why are you so terrified of Gary Lineker's tweets? Why aren't you cross about, I don't know, Prue Leith's support for Brexit when she was presenting Bake Off on the BBC? What would he say? Would he say, I'm not terrified of Gary Lineker's tweets. I just think it's wrong that he should tweet about sewage when he's a football presenter. I mean, how do they not run out of words?
It's just purely the fact that they need someone to shout at and show as an enemy and a person that doesn't understand what's going on and shouldn't have an opinion because he isn't a politician, and politicians know what they're doing.
Yeah, maybe. And then you're back to that story they ran about how some of us had lost a few Twitter followers when Elon Musk announced that he was going to... So it's the fact they can't control it. They can't close it down. I mean, much more Lineker than me or others, but that idea that you can... What's the point in having a newspaper? Some of them run at a loss now. I think these TV stations are hemorrhaging money. What's the point of spending tons and tons and tons of money from your offshore non-dom accounts if some jumped-up crisp salesman like Gary Lineker can speak directly to 6 million people from his Twitter account? We must close him down. I think that's what it is. That's probably where it comes from. That would explain why the generals have got their noses so completely out of joint. Does it really explain why the foot soldiers just pretending? You know, we're so frightened. Silly Steve Bryan is terrified of Gary Lineker's tweets. Imagine if he went into politics. 11:48 is the time. I guess it is that simple, isn't it? So you can publish the Spectator magazine, which routinely carries articles Enoch Powell would be proud of, while presenting the BBC's flagship political programmes, and no one at the Daily Mail or the Daily Telegraph or indeed in the Conservative Party will raise an eyebrow. But if you present their football programming and you tweet, as a politician, how could you ever under any circumstances bring yourself to vote for pumping sewage into our seas unfathomable, then silly Steve Bryan will have a hissy fit. He'll throw his rattle straight out the pram. Why? And actually, it's a good job we had so many clips, because I think it's quite obvious. I can't believe it eluded me. It's probably because I'm so middle class, you see. I'm so metropolitan elite. I didn't quite understand that Lineker's background is working class. His dad was a market trader on Leicester Market. Do you know that his dad used to play cards with Engelbert Humperdinck? Another sort of... probably Leicester's second most famous son. After the Crisps, Lineker and Humperdinck, probably the most famous exports from Leicester. He told me that in Full Disclosure. Was it Did he do Full Disclosure or did he do the one before Full Disclosure? He did Full Disclosure, didn't he? No, he did the one before Full Disclosure, which is also available on Global Player. I did another series of podcasts called Unfiltered for another organisation, but you can get them on Global Player as well if you've run out of Full Disclosures. I didn't put one out last week. Got a cracker for you this week, though. I'm going to record it this afternoon. 11:50 is the time. Why are they so terrified of Gary Lineker's tweets? I think we found a consensus, a unanimous answer to this. And the hypocrisy involved in media outlets having absolute heebie-jeebies about politics. I mean, have heebie-jeebies about Gary Lineker's Twitter account while completely ignoring various people that they would be more simpatico with. And the big problem, of course, is that no one would get that concerned if Greg Wallace tweeted about politics, tweeted something a bit right-wing, something a bit anti-Labour. Where would the bonfire be lit? Where in the British media would this be made a fuss of? And I'll remind you what's on the front of the Mail today, how the left-wing Twitterati crowd, these people are absolutely off the charts now. The left-wing Twitterati crowed as the heavens opened just before. That's what it is. It's not just the fact that people who aren't doing the bidding of newspaper owners
bụi phấn rơi rơi ôm cho đời hoa thơm quả ngọt có một nghề mồ hôi nhỏ giọt lặng lẽ bên ngọn đèn tràng giáo án đêm dòng sông cả cuộc